She's standing at my door at 8 in the evening and something is wrong. I can see it in the way she's wearing her coat. Like armor she needed to put back on before she could face me. Ines Varga does not come to my apartment unannounced. She does not look like this. She says her mother called her selfish. She says her brother told the family everything. She says she is prepared to pay the cost, and I look at her face, composed and tired and entirely certain, and I understand that I am the cost she means. The woman who said, "Then she's my mistake now," is standing in my hallway, and she is not taking it back. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Before you understand the dinner, you need to understand Marco. Marco Varga was the kind of man who walked into a room and made you feel like the only person in it. Not through effort, through ease. He had the particular charm of someone who had never had to earn anything directly and had instead developed, in the place where ambition usually grows, a talent for making others feel significant. He was 30 years old, handsome in the way that photographs well, and he laughed at exactly the right moments and remembered the details you had mentioned 3 conversations ago, and texted you at 7 in the morning about the article he had read that made him think of you. He was excellent at the beginning of things. I met him at a gallery opening in October, at the kind of event where the art is secondary to the networking, and everyone is slightly overdressed. He was standing in front of a large blue canvas looking genuinely confused by it, and I said, without thinking, that I thought the artist was making the viewer do half the work. He turned around and said, "Explain." Not politely, genuinely, like he had identified me as the person who would actually tell him. We talked for 2 hours. He called the following day, called, not texted, which nobody did anymore, and asked me to dinner with a directness that felt like its own kind of compliment. I told my best friend B about him on a Sunday morning over coffee. I described him as someone who made you feel chosen, and she asked whether feeling chosen was the same as being right for each other. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was a careful way to avoid the question, and she was right. And we both let it pass because the coffee was good, and October was doing something beautiful outside the window. 8 months. I spent 8 months with Marco Varga, and for most of them I was genuinely happy in the specific way that is possible when you are with someone who is good at making you feel valued before you have looked too closely at what the value is built on. The family was a gradual reveal, not secretive, just compartmentalized, the way certain people keep things in order. He talked about them selectively. His mother, Adela, who had held the Varga real estate portfolio together after his father died 5 years ago, and who Marco spoke about with the particular combination of reverence and exhaustion that children of strong-willed parents develop as a survival mechanism. His sister Ines, a senior partner at an architecture firm downtown, who he described as brilliant and difficult, and the only person in the family who ever said exactly what she meant. And various extended family, cousins, an aunt, a network of people who had attended the same schools and summered in the same places for 3 generations. I met Ines for the first time by accident, not by design. It was month 4. Marco and I had just had lunch and were walking out of the restaurant when he saw her across the street. She was coming out of her office building in a dark coat that fit the way expensive things fit when they are made for a specific body. She saw us, paused, and crossed. Marco introduced us with the slightly distracted energy of a man handling an unexpected scheduling conflict. Ines Varga was 34 years old and had her mother's bone structure and her own particular stillness. She shook my hand with the clean, measured grip of someone for whom handshakes are information rather than gesture. Her eyes moved over me in approximately 2 seconds, not rudely, just completely. Like an assessment conducted with professional efficiency, the way she probably evaluated a structural drawing before she approved it. Nothing was wasted in the looking. "Tara," she said. My name in her mouth was a complete statement. Not warm, not cold. Precise. Marco has mentioned you, I said, because I had to say something. I'm sure he has, she said. And something in the way she said it, not dismissive, just knowing, made me understand that Ines Varga had a very clear picture of which parts of himself her brother was likely to have shared. The interaction lasted 4 minutes. She had a meeting. She left the way she had arrived, economically, without surplus. Marco watched her go and said, She's not unfriendly. She's just Ines. Like the name was its own explanation. I thought about those 4 seconds of assessment for 3 days. Not because they had made me feel judged, because they had made me feel legible, in the way you feel legible when someone is actually paying attention to what they are looking at. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was an honest one. I did not put a name to what I was thinking. I was with Marco. I told myself to file it away. The family dinner was scheduled for March. Adela hosted quarterly, a tradition maintained with the particular discipline of women who run households the way generals run campaigns. The dinners were, by Marco's account, not optional. He spent 2 days preparing me for it. What to wear, what to say about my work, what not to raise. He ran through it with the organized anxiety of someone who loved his family and was deeply afraid of what they would think about the things he also loved, and that anxiety told me more than the instructions did. I dressed carefully. Dark blouse, the kind that reads as put together without reading as trying. I told myself I was nervous because meeting a partner's family is inherently nerve-producing, not because I had a specific nameless feeling about one particular member of it. The house was large and old and beautiful in the way that came from decades of careful maintenance rather than recent renovation. It smelled of fresh flowers and something baked, and the particular clean warmth of a house managed with intention for a very long time. Adela met us at the door in a cream-colored dress that was either simple or very expensive, probably both, and the composed graciousness of a woman who had been hosting people for 40 years and knew exactly how much warmth to deploy and exactly when to withdraw it. She kissed Marco on both cheeks and turned to me with a smile that reached the correct distance. Tara, she said, we have heard about you. I said I was very glad to finally meet her. I meant it, which was perhaps the mistake. Raphael, Marco's cousin, was already there. 31. Warm in the uncomplicated way of someone who makes it available without conditions. He shook my hand with actual pleasure and asked 2 intelligent questions about my work that showed he had genuinely looked it up. I liked him immediately. Aunt Constanza was settled in the sitting room with a glass of something clear and the contentment of someone attending these dinners as a pleasant formality. She asked where I lived and told me she had bought her first apartment in the same neighborhood 40 years ago. I filed her under trustworthy. Ines arrived 8 minutes after us, alone. She was in dark trousers and a silk shirt in a deep green that worked with her coloring in a way that looked effortless and was definitely not accidental. She moved through the entry hall with the quiet economy I had cataloged since October, kissed her mother's cheek, touched Raphael's shoulder in greeting, and stopped when she reached me. Tara, she said again, the same precise delivery. My name in her mouth doing the same precise, complete thing. Ines, I said. You look well, she said. Not a compliment exactly, not warm, just an observation offered honestly. She moved past me toward the sitting room. The back of her neck, above the collar of the silk shirt, carried the faint trace of something dry and cedar adjacent that lodged itself in my memory before I had given it permission to. I told myself I was nervous. That is why details imprint themselves under pressure. Adrenaline makes everything sharp. I told myself this for approximately the next hour with decreasing conviction. The first part of dinner was fine. Adela was formally warm, Raphael kept the conversation alive with the practiced skill of someone who had been doing it since childhood. There were 7 of us at the table, including Constanza, and the food was very good, and the wine was better, and the conversation moved through the topics that family dinners in that kind of house move through. Ines said little. She ate with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything, answered direct questions with direct answers, and otherwise watched the table with an expression I could not parse. Once, when Raphael made a joke about the property dispute Marco had told me not to raise, I caught Ines's gaze moving to Marco for one measured half-second before returning to her plate. The movement was small enough that only someone watching closely would catch it. I was watching closely. I was beginning to understand that watching Ines Varga was something I had been doing for 4 months without a useful category for it. The problem began over dessert. Adela asked about my family in the particular way that certain mothers ask. Not with hostility, but with the specific assessment that passes for friendly curiosity when the friendliness is conditional. My mother was a retired school teacher. My father was in logistics. Middle class, straightforward. The answer landed in the room with a slight internal adjustment, like a piece of furniture moved an inch. "And your apartment?" Adela said. "You rent, Marco tells me." "Yes," I said. "South side?" Adela said. It was not a word. It carried substantial information about what she thought of me and was constructed to be technically undeniable. Marco said something about the neighborhood being convenient to my office. I could hear the effort in it. The specific effort of a man who loved his mother and was trying to manage 2 conversations at once. I felt the effort and felt what it meant that it required effort, and I said nothing. The conversation moved on. Constanza asked about a gallery opening. Raphael mentioned a project. Ines added 2 precise sentences about a building she had visited that connected to what Raphael was describing, and the 2 sentences were so exactly right that everyone at the table thought about them. After dessert, Adela asked Marco to come with her to the kitchen to help with the coffee service, which was not normal. There was household staff for the coffee. I registered this with the particular alertness of someone who has just understood the shape of what is happening even though the specific content has not yet arrived. I stayed at the table instead of going to the sitting room, looking at the cleared plates and the candlelight and the formal napkins. And then I heard Adela's voice from the kitchen. She had not pitched it for privacy. She said, in the tone of precise, loving concern, "Carino, she is not for you. A girl like this, she does not fit. She is a mistake. Do you understand me? She is a nice girl, but she is a mistake for this family." And Marco said, "I know, Mama. I know." 3 words. That is all it took to undo 8 months. Not 3 words from her. That was a verdict from a woman who had decided long before tonight who her son deserved. But 3 words from him. "I know." Delivered without hesitation, without so much as a breath of pushback. Just, "I know, Mama." And then the sound of the coffee being prepared. I put my hand flat on the table. My wine glass was in front of me. The dining room was empty except for me and the white tablecloth, and the soft sound of 2 people in the kitchen beginning to discuss something else entirely as if nothing had happened. Then Ines came back. She had been in the hallway. I did not know for how long. She walked into the dining room with the same economic stride and stopped when she saw my face. She looked at me for 2 full seconds, the way she had looked at me in October. That complete assessment, nothing wasted in the looking, and she did not ask what had happened because she had heard. I could see that she had heard. She sat down. Not across the table. 1 seat to my left. Close enough that I could smell the cedar and the evening and the silk of that green shirt, and close enough that when she moved, even slightly, I was aware of it. She set her wine glass down. She looked at me. Her face was composed in the absolute, effortful way that is different from natural calm. The way a person looks when they are holding something very still by force rather than because it is naturally still. The composure was real. The effort behind it was also real. I was, in that moment, close enough to see both. She said, "Then she's my mistake now." It was not loud. It was not performed for anyone listening. It was said the way someone says a decision they have already made. Not to the room, not to the sound of her mother's voice still fading from the hallway, but to me specifically, with the kind of directness I had only ever seen from her and had not, until that moment, understood, was also a form of something I did not yet have a name for. I looked at her. The dining room light was warm and the evening had turned formal and strange around us, and Ines Varga was sitting one seat to my left, looking at me with those gray cataloging eyes, as if she had just drawn a line in the air and was waiting to see if I understood what it meant. I did not understand all of what it meant. Not yet. I said, "That is a very expensive thing to say to your mother." She said, "She has said more expensive things to me." The kitchen door opened. Marco and Adela came back with the coffee tray and the dinner resumed its surface around us, and Ines picked up her wine glass and looked at the wall, and the moment closed over like water closing over a stone that has just been dropped. But the stone had dropped, and I felt it at the bottom of everything for the rest of the evening. The drive home was the worst kind of silence, not empty, but packed with everything Marco was not saying. He drove with one hand on the wheel, and his jaw in the particular configuration that I had learned meant he was composing a version of reality he found bearable. He said, at a red light, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounded." I said, "How does she mean it?" He said, "She's protective. She's always been protective." I said, "Of what exactly?" He did not answer. The light changed. He drove. I said, "I heard you, Marco. I wasn't supposed to, but I heard you." The silence that followed was not the composing kind. It was the found-out kind, and it had a different texture entirely. Heavier, less organized, with no comfortable version available to retreat into. He said, "I was just saying what she needed to hear. She escalates when she feels..." I was trying to calm her down. It didn't mean... It meant exactly what it meant, I said, quietly, without anger yet, because the anger was still arriving, still processing itself in the back of my chest, turning from hurt into something cleaner and harder. He said, "Tara." I said, "Don't." He pulled up to my building. I had my door open before he had fully stopped. Not dramatically, just with the efficiency of a person who understands that staying in a car will not change what a car ride has already revealed. He said my name again through the open door. I said, "I'll call you tomorrow." I would not call him tomorrow. We both knew it. I said it because I needed to end the conversation and not because it was true. I went upstairs and sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet under the sink, which is where I go when something has broken open in me and I do not want the rest of the furniture to witness it. I called B. She answered in 2 rings. She said, "How bad?" I said, "He told his mother she was right." A pause. Very short. The kind that is not surprise, but the specific beat of a person deciding how honest to be when someone finally catches up to something they have been watching from a distance. She said, "I'll bring the wine." B arrived 40 minutes later with a bottle of red, and the steady, no commentary presence I valued more than I had ever told her. She sat on the kitchen floor with me because that was where I was, and she did not try to move me to the couch. She poured 2 glasses and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "What did the sister do?" I looked at her. "How did you know anything about the sister?" "You mentioned her twice in 4 months. That is twice more than you mentioned anyone else in that family who was not Marco." I held my wine glass. I thought about the green silk shirt and the cedar and the one seat to my left and the precise, complete delivery of, "Then she's my mistake now." She said something in the dining room. She heard what her mother said, and she said something. "What did she say?" I told her. B listened with the particular attention she brought to things that actually mattered. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That is a strange thing to say to someone your brother is dating," she said finally. What did her face look like when she said it? I thought about it. The gray eyes and the effort behind the composure and the specific quality of looking at someone as if they are the problem you find most interesting in the room. "Like she meant it," I said. B said nothing. She refilled my glass. The kitchen floor was cold, and outside my window the city was still going about its evening with complete indifference to anything that had broken open in apartment 4C. I texted Marco the next morning. Not from anger, from clarity, which is different and harder to argue with. I told him I was not ending things because of his mother's opinion. I was ending things because his response. The 3 words. The total absence of any form of resistance, the drive home spent composing bearable versions, had told me something I could not unknow. Not that he was a bad person, that when it came to the things that actually mattered, he was not going to choose me. He responded with paragraphs that circled the point without touching it. I did not respond to those paragraphs, and by evening the thing was done in the way things are done when both people understand what the truth is, and one of them has finally said it out loud. I thought that was the end of the Varga chapter of my life. I was wrong about that in the specific way you are wrong when you have been looking at the obvious thing from the wrong angle. 3 days after the dinner, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. The message said, "This is Ines. I would like to speak with you, if you are willing. Not on behalf of Marco or my mother, on my own." I read it 3 times. B was with me. We were at her apartment with takeout, and I handed her the phone without saying anything. She read it. She handed it back. "Well?" she said. "Yeah," I said. "What are you going to say?" I typed, "Tomorrow, afternoon. You pick the place." She sent back an address and a time. A coffee shop, not a restaurant. Public, neutral. The choice of someone who was being careful about what the meeting looked like. I recognized the carefulness. I respected it. The coffee shop was on the north side of the city, close to the architecture district. The kind of place that existed in the overlap between expensive and unpretentious. Good wood. Real light from high windows, no background music trying to be noticed. I arrived 3 minutes early and found a seat near the front window. Ines arrived at exactly the time she had named, not early enough to signal anxiety, not late enough to make a statement. Precise. She was in a dark blazer over a plain white shirt, her hair loose today. It changed the proportion of her, made her look less official and more present. In every professional context I had observed her, she kept it pinned, and seeing it down felt like being given information she did not usually make available. I noticed it the way I had noticed the green shirt, the cedar, the 4 seconds of assessment in October. She sat down. She looked at me. She said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet." I said, "You didn't explain why you wanted to." She said, "No. I wasn't sure you would come if I explained first." That was honest enough to earn a direct response. I said, "What do you want to say?" She was quiet for a moment. She folded her hands on the table with the composed deliberation I had come to recognize as her way of organizing herself before precision. A server brought her coffee, which she had ordered at the counter on her way in. She had not asked what I wanted. My cup was also already on the table. 1 sugar, no milk. I had mentioned this exactly once, 2 months ago in a passing comment at a family dinner that I had not thought she was paying attention to. I said nothing about the coffee. I absorbed it. She said, I want to tell you that what my mother said was wrong, not wrong in the way polite people describe things as inappropriate. Wrong in the way that applies when someone has made an assessment of another person's worth using criteria that have nothing to do with that person's actual worth. She said, "And I want to tell you that Marco should have said something. The fact that he did not is not a thing I can excuse or explain away. I am not here to do that." I said, "Then why are you here?" She looked at me. In the window light, her gray eyes were less guarded than they usually were. Not open. Ines Varga was not an open person, but more visible. Like she had decided to let me see a little further in than she usually permitted. She said, "Because I said something in that dining room, and I wanted to say it again in a setting where you could respond to it honestly, where there was no performance required of either of us." "Then she's my mistake now," I said. "Yes," she said. "What does that mean?" She said, "It means that if my family's treatment of you has cost you something, and it has, then I am responsible for the part of that which falls within my reach to address. You were a guest in that house. The hospitality extended was conditional in ways not made clear to you, and you deserved better." "That is a formal way of saying you feel guilty," I said. "I do feel guilty. Guilt is appropriate when you have failed to act, and someone else has paid the cost." I watched my mother say what she said, and I watched my brother fail to respond, and I stood in the hallway for 20 seconds deciding what to do about it. 20 seconds is too long. "Why did you need 20 seconds? She looked at her coffee, then back at me. "Because," she said, "the version of what I wanted to say and the version that would be appropriate for me to say are not always the same thing. And the appropriate version took 20 seconds to find." I stared at her. Something in the room reorganized itself around that sentence, quietly, without making any noise about it. "What was the version you wanted to say?" I asked. She held my gaze for one long beat. "That is a longer conversation," she said, "and this one is not finished yet." I let it pass. I told myself it was a figure of speech, the way careful people describe incomplete thoughts. I told myself the version she had wanted to say was probably just something less formal than the version she had delivered. I was probably wrong about that. I was choosing not to be right about it yet. We talked for an hour. She asked about my work. Not the polite version, but the real version, what it required of me, what I found genuinely interesting about it, where it was difficult. I told her, and she listened with the quality of attention I had first noticed in October, not nodding along but genuinely tracking, asking the follow-up that showed she had heard not just the words, but the thing underneath them. I asked about her work. She described a project she was midway through, a mixed-use building in a neighborhood undergoing transformation, the specific tension of designing something structurally excellent and socially complicated, how she thought about that tension every morning when she sat at her drawing table. She talked about it with the focused, honest engagement of someone whose work was a genuinely moral exercise, and not just a professional one. I thought, I have been in this family's orbit for 8 months and have never had this conversation with any member of it. I am having it with the one I was least prepared for. I caught myself thinking that, and filed it with the green shirt and the cedar and the one seat to my left. When we stood up to leave, she held the door. Outside on the November pavement, she put her hands in the pockets of the dark blazer and looked at me in the gray afternoon light, with the hair she usually kept pinned falling loose against her collar. She said, "If you need anything, with the logistics of the breakup, if there are complications, you can contact me." I said, "That is a strange thing to offer someone you have spoken to twice." She said, "You have been managing a complicated situation that my family created. It seems appropriate to offer what I can." I said, "You don't have to take responsibility for what your family did." She said, "I know." She looked at me for one beat. That complete, cataloging look. I am choosing to. She walked. I watched her go. The dark blazer, the unhurried stride, the loose hair in the November air, and stood on the pavement long enough that a woman passing by looked at me curiously. I called B. B said, "How was it?" I said, "Strange." B said, "Strange good or strange concerning?" I thought about the version of what I wanted to say and the version that would be appropriate for me to say are not always the same thing. Strange, I said again. I don't have a better word yet. The following 2 weeks were straightforward in the practical sense. Marco and I exchanged a small number of messages. Nothing hostile, nothing unresolvable. We handled the end with the mutual civility of two people who had been basically decent to each other and had simply reached the boundary of what they were capable of building together. I did not miss him the way I had expected to. I missed the beginning of things, the gallery, and October, and the evenings when he had been new enough to be genuinely fascinating. What I did not miss was the version of things that had been operating under the surface, the quiet, ongoing management of his mother's opinion of me, the choosing of the comfortable version over the honest one, the 3 words delivered without hesitation. I told myself this was clean. I told myself I was fine. B told me I was doing a very convincing impression of someone who had resolved something when I had in fact only identified a different something I was not yet ready to look at directly. Contact from Ines came in unexpected ways. Not often. She was not a person who flooded communication channels. Twice in 2 weeks she sent messages that were brief and purposeful. The first was a link to an article about a neighborhood development project she had remembered. From our coffee conversation, I had mentioned caring about. The article was good. I read it twice and caught myself reading it a 3rd time. The second was a direct question asking whether I had heard from Marco recently, because she had been unable to reach him and needed to coordinate a family matter. I had not heard from Marco. I told her so. She said, "Thank you." And then, after a pause long enough to be deliberate, "I hope the adjustment is going smoothly." I looked at that message for a while. The adjustment. The word was clinical enough to be careful and specific enough to mean more than it said. I said, "It is. Thank you." I put my phone down. I picked it up again. I said, "If you wanted to get coffee again, I would not object." She said, "Saturday. Same place. 11. I closed the app. I looked at my ceiling and asked myself, with the honest clarity I tried to apply to most things in my life, what exactly I was doing. I had a partial answer. It was not comfortable. I was not yet ready to look at it full on. Saturday at 11, she was there before me, coffee already ordered, mine on the table correctly. She had remembered from a single coffee meeting 2 weeks ago, 1 sugar and no milk. And I sat down across from her and thought about what it meant that I noticed she had remembered, and what it meant that it mattered to me. We talked for 2 hours. She described when I asked what it had been like to grow up as the oldest Varga child, the particular responsibility of being the one who understood the most and was expected to carry the most, the family's implicit belief that her composure was a resource available to everyone in the household, when in fact it was something she had built at significant personal cost and maintained by choice, rather than by nature. She told me this without bitterness. She told me it the way architects describe load-bearing walls. This is structural. This is what holds the thing up. This is not a flaw. I told her about my own family, my mother's practicality, and my father's patience, and the particular education of growing up in a house where you were loved without being wealthy, which teaches you with great specificity what actually costs something and what does not. She listened. She asked questions. She had the quality, rare and rarer still in people who are very intelligent, of making you feel that what you were saying was worth the air it was taking up. Not flattery, the quality of genuine interest in a person that is not about extracting information, but about understanding something. I watched her face while I talked, the clean line of the jaw, the way her eyes tracked with her own thoughts while she was listening to mine, connecting things, following threads. The single quality of her composure, not absence, but presence, the specific fullness of a woman who was entirely in a conversation rather than managing her exit from it. I thought, I have never had a conversation this good. I need to be careful about what I am doing here. I thought both of those things and finished my coffee and ordered another. On the pavement outside, she held the door again. The November air was cold and useful, the kind that makes everything very clear and removes the option of comfortable softening. She looked at me with the loose hair and the dark coat, and her hands in her pockets, and that complete, cataloging attention that I had been the subject of since October and had never quite known what to do with. She said, "Tara." I said, "What?" She said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." A pause. The city moved around us. Something in her composure was working in the harder way, not cracking, not breaking, just visibly maintained by an effort that was almost visible at the edges if you knew what to look for. She said, "The last 2 weeks, these conversations, are they something you are doing because you are processing the end of things with Marco, or are they something else?" I looked at her for a long time. I thought about the most honest answer, the one that required something from me rather than the comfortable version that kept everything at a safe distance. I said, "I started thinking they might be something else about 4 days ago." Her breath did one small, barely visible thing, not dramatic, barely a thing at all. The kind of movement that only matters if you are already paying very close attention, which I was. She said, "All right. I needed to know that." She looked at the pavement for a moment, then back at me. Her face was doing the work harder now, the effort behind the composure more visible, because she had decided to let it be visible, and the decision was its own kind of information. She said, "Then I want to tell you something. The 20 seconds I told you about. In the hallway. The version you wanted to say," I said. "Yes." She held my gaze without flinching. The version I wanted to say had nothing to do with hospitality or the appropriate response to an unkind comment made in a kitchen. It had to do with the fact that I have been watching you navigate my family's indifference for 8 months and thinking very specific things about what that situation should look like instead, if things were different. The pavement was cold. The street was going about its business with complete indifference. Somewhere behind us, a cafe door opened and released warmth and the smell of coffee into the November air. I said, "That is the most important thing you have said to me." She said, "I know. I have been trying to find the right time to say it." I said, "There is no right time for things like that. There is only time, and the choice to use it." She looked at me. The composure was holding, but the something underneath it was visible now, present, real, requiring nothing from you except to look at it. She said, "I know you are 2 weeks out of something that cost you something real. I want to be clear that I am not standing on this pavement trying to replace what you have just lost or offering myself as the practical alternative to something that hurt you." I said, "I know you're not." She said, "I am standing here because the honest version is better than the appropriate version, and I have been choosing the appropriate version for 8 months and I am tired of it." I looked at her. The cold was sharpening everything. The loose hair against her collar. The cedar, even in the open air, even in November. Something of it reaching me. The specific quality of her attention on me, which I was done pretending was ordinary. I said, I am not in a place yet to know what I want. You should know that. She said, I know. I said, but I would like to keep having these conversations. She said, so would I. I said, and I would like you to stop pretending they are only about coffee. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. I had been cataloging her millimeters for months without a name for the cataloging, and now I had a name for it, and it was sitting between us on the cold November pavement like something that had arrived and could not be sent back. She said, I will stop pretending if you will. I said, that is a deal. She held out her hand. It was a precise, entirely Ines gesture, formalizing an informal agreement with the same economy she brought to everything, converting the serious thing into something that could be held. I took her hand. It was warm, which surprised me. Her grip was brief and certain, and she released my hand before I had finished cataloging the warmth of it, and the releasing itself was a form of restraint that told me something. She said, Saturday after next. I said, same place. She said, I'll be there first. She walked. I watched her go. The dark coat, the unhurried stride, the loose hair in the November air, and thought about what it means to finally stop looking away from the thing that has been looking back at you. I did not have a complete answer. I had the cold November air and the warmth of a hand already released, and the knowledge that Ines Varga had just told me, in the precise and careful language that was the only language she trusted herself with, something that was going to require me to be honest in ways I was not yet certain I was prepared for. I walked home. I called B. She answered in one ring, which was faster than usual. She said, what happened? Not a question, a statement, because she always knew. I said, I need to think. She said, about the sister. I stopped walking. She said, Tara, I have been watching you talk about her for 2 weeks. I can count. I said, she said something. B said, what did she say? I told her, the 20 seconds in the hallway, the version that was different from the appropriate version, the one sugar and no milk remembered from a single conversation, the hand on the cold pavement. B was quiet for a long time. Then she said, are you okay? I said, I honestly don't know what I am. She said, do you want me to come over? I said, no. I think I need to sit with this one on my own for a while. She said, okay. A pause. But Tara, the thing you said about her face, the first night, you said she looked like she meant it. I said, I remember. B said, I think she did. I think she has for a while. B said, I'm just telling you what I can see from where I am standing. The rest is yours to work out. I went home. I sat in my apartment with the November dark coming in through the window, and the warmth of Ines's hand still present somewhere in the sense memory of my own, and thought about what it means to start looking at something you have been choosing not to look at for the better part of 8 months. It was not comfortable. It was very honest. Those two things, I was beginning to understand, were often the same experience. I made tea. I thought about, then she's my mistake now, and the 20 seconds it had cost her, and the 8 months of precise, quiet attention that had been the only honest thing in a situation built largely on comfortable fictions. I thought about the appropriate version and the version that was actually true, and the fact that she had been carrying both of them for months and had finally, on a cold November pavement, put one of them down. I thought about the fact that she had said, I will stop pretending if you will, and I had said, that is a deal. Saturday after next was 9 days away. 9 days felt like a very long time and like no time at all. Both feelings were accurate. Both of them were, in their own way, a beginning. The 9 days were long in the way that things are long when you have given yourself permission to want something, and the permission itself is the new problem. I went to work. I ran my usual routes. I ate breakfast and answered messages and attended meetings and did all the structural things that keep a life functional while something underneath it is reorganizing itself. I did not contact Ines during the 9 days, partly because I had said I needed time to think, and she had accepted that without argument, and partly because I understood, in the way you understand things about a person after you have been paying attention to them for 8 months, that she would not have wanted to be chased through the silence. She had said what she said. She had offered what she offered. The next step was mine to take, and she had the patience to wait for me to take it. I thought about her more than I had expected to. Not in the abstract, in the specific. The cedar. The one seat to my left. The warmth of the hand she had released before I had finished registering it. The precise delivery of 20 sentences to me in 8 months and what it meant that I had been counting. I called B on the 4th day, not because I was struggling with it. I had moved past struggling into something more like orientation, the work of figuring out where you are after the map changes. She said, "You've been sitting with it." I said, "I have?" I think she has been paying attention to me for a long time, and I have been choosing not to look at it directly because looking at it directly would have required me to reconsider something I wasn't ready to reconsider. B said, "Which was?" I said, "That I was in the right relationship." A pause. B had the particular grace of someone who does not say "I told you so," because she understands that people arrive at accurate things on their own schedule, and the schedule is the point. She said, "Are you scared?" I thought about it honestly. "Not of her," I said. "Of what it means that I missed this for 8 months." B said, "You didn't miss it. You managed it. Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment. "Go to the coffee on Saturday. The rest will come." I went on Saturday. She was there before me, as promised. Dark coat on the chair beside her, coffee already ordered for both of us. She was reading something on her phone with the focused, half-absent attention of someone waiting without wanting to look like they are waiting. When I pushed through the door, she looked up. Her face did the small visible thing. Not a smile, something less obvious and more real, the specific adjustment of a person who has just confirmed something they had needed to confirm. I sat down. I said, "You ordered correctly." She said, "I remembered." I said, "I know you did. I have been thinking about what that means." She held my gaze. "What have you decided it means?" I said, "That you have been paying attention to me in ways I was not fully accounting for, and that the coffee is the least of it." She said, "Yes." I said, "I spent 8 months in your family's house, and the only room in it where I did not feel like a problem to be managed was the room where you were also in it." Her jaw moved once. A small, controlled thing. She looked at the table and then back at me. She said, "I know." I said, "I need you to know that I am not here because you said the right things. I am here because I have been paying attention to you for 8 months, and I am done pretending I was only doing it to understand Marco better." She looked at me for a long moment. The coffee shop was warm and ordinary around us, and outside the November window the city was doing its gray, practical Saturday things, and Ines Varga was looking at me with that complete, cataloging attention, and something underneath it that was no longer being as carefully managed as it usually was. She said, "I want to be careful with you. I want you to know that. I am aware of the specific timing of all of this, and I am not going to use it." I said, "I know you're not. That is partly why I came back." She said, "What is the other part?" I looked at her. At the loose hair and the gray eyes and the specific quality of her presence, the fullness of it, the economy of it, the way she took up exactly the space she needed and not 1 inch more, and somehow made that precision feel like the most intimate thing in the room. I said, You. She held my gaze. She did not say anything for a moment. And then she reached across the table and turned her coffee cup 1/4 turn with 2 fingers. A small, precise gesture, the kind of thing people do when they need their hands to be doing something rather than sitting still, and said, "All right." That was the beginning of what I started, privately and then less privately, calling the Saturdays. They were not always Saturday by the time November became December. They were Tuesday evenings at the wine bar 2 streets from her office, and Thursday mornings before my first meeting when she happened to be near my part of the city for a site visit, and one Sunday afternoon that lasted 4 hours and covered her architectural firm's founding story and my theory about brand strategy as a fundamentally empathetic discipline, and the question of whether either of us had ever been actually good at asking for help. The answer, it emerged, was no. Not in the ways that mattered. We had both developed, from different angles and for different reasons, the skill of managing our own difficulties before anyone else could notice them. She from the cost of being the eldest in a family that treated her composure as a structural element, me from a childhood in a house where the adults were loving and busy, and you learned early that your smaller problems were yours to carry. I told her this on the Sunday afternoon. She listened in the way she always listened, completely, with the specific tracking quality that made you feel the words were landing somewhere useful rather than just filling air. She said, "That sounds like a very efficient childhood." I said, "It was. It also meant I was very good at being fine and not very good at being honest about what fine was costing me." She said, "Yes." A pause. "I recognize that," she said. "I have been, for most of my adult life, the person who is expected to know what to do. In my family, in my work, in the rooms I walk into. It became the version of myself I trusted. The one who does not need." I said, "And the other version?" She looked at me. She said, "The other version makes things complicated." I said, "Like this." She said, "Like this." I held my wine glass. I said, "I think the version of you that makes things complicated is the one that said, 'Then she's my mistake now,' in a dining room full of family witnesses without flinching." She was very still for a moment. She said, "That was not complicated. That was the clearest thing I said all evening." I said, "I know. That is what I am telling you." We looked at each other across the table in the Sunday afternoon light, and it was the kind of moment that has no clean category. The specific, suspended territory between two people who have been circling the honest thing and are finally close enough to see it clearly. She said, "I would like to take you somewhere. Not coffee, not a wine bar. Somewhere I actually want to show you." The address she sent was a building she had designed 3 years ago, a converted warehouse on the east side of the city that had become a mixed creative use space, galleries on the ground floor and studios above, and a rooftop that was technically not open to the public, but for which she, as the architect, still had access. She had designed it at the point in her career when she was good enough to be commissioned for something that mattered, and still early enough to be idealistic about what it should do. She met me outside and she was wearing the dark coat and her hair was up, the professional version, which I had not seen for weeks. And I understood, from the detail, that showing me this building was something she was nervous about. The hair was her armor. She was wearing it because she needed it. She took me through the building the way architects walk through spaces they have made, not with pride exactly, but with the specific honest attention of someone accounting for what they intended and what they actually achieved. She pointed out the structural decision that had cost them 3 weeks of redesign and the window placement she had argued for over the developer's objection, and the corner of the gallery floor, where the light hit differently than she had planned and was, she thought, better for it. I watched her talk about it more than I watched the building. She was most alive in precisely this. the precise, honest accounting of something she had made. The composure was still present but used differently, not as containment but as accuracy, and the difference was considerable. On the rooftop, in the December cold, she stood at the parapet and looked out over the east side of the city with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small, visible clouds in the air. She said, "I designed this building when I still believed that every project could solve something." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I believe that every project can do something honest, which is smaller than solving but more reliable." I stood beside her at the parapet. The city was laid out in front of us in the December gray, and the cold was sharp and useful. And I was close enough to her that our arms were almost touching through the coats. Not touching, but close enough that I was aware of the almost. I said, "That is the most architectural thing you have ever said to me." She said, "It applies outside of architecture." I said, "I know." A pause. The city hummed below us. She turned her head and looked at me, and in the December light on the rooftop she looked both entirely composed and entirely present, which was the specific combination that had been the most consistently destabilizing thing about her from the very beginning. She said, "Tara." I said, "What?" She said, "I want to say the longer thing, the rest of the version I told you about, if you are ready to hear it." I said, "I am ready." She turned to face me properly. She looked at me with the gray eyes and the careful composure, and underneath the composure the thing that had been there since October and was done being appropriate. She said, "I noticed you in September, before Marco introduced us. You were at an event, a funding reception for a project my firm was involved in. You were talking to someone across the room, and you said something that made them laugh without expecting to. And you looked surprised by it, and I thought, she is the most honestly present person in this room." I stared at her. She said, "I did not know you were who you were. When Marco mentioned he was seeing someone and described you, I understood the coincidence, and I put it away because it was not useful information. I was your boyfriend's sister. You were Marco's girlfriend. The appropriate version was the only permissible one." She said, "And then I met you in October on the street, and the appropriate version became significantly harder to maintain." I said, "September." She said, "September." I thought about the 8 months, the one seat to my left in a dining room, the one sugar and no milk, the 20 seconds in a hallway, the article she had sent because she remembered in passing that I cared about a neighborhood, the hand on the cold November pavement. 8 months, and none of it had been about Marco. She had been carrying it the entire time, and had done so with a discipline and a silence that was both the most admirable and the most exhausting thing I had ever witnessed up close. I said, "You should have said something." She said, "I know. I chose the appropriate version instead." I said, "For 8 months?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you were with my brother and what I was feeling was not his fault or yours, and choosing the appropriate version was the only form of it that didn't cost either of you something you hadn't agreed to pay." I looked at her. The cold was doing something useful to the moment, stripping it of every option except the honest one. I said, "It cost you." She said, "Yes, it cost me." I said, "And now?" She held my gaze. She did not look away, and she did not reach for the appropriate version. She said, "Now I am standing on a rooftop in December telling you something I have been choosing not to say for 9 months, which is that you are the most honestly present person I have been in proximity to in a very long time, and I have wanted to be in your orbit, specifically and entirely, since September. And I am done choosing the appropriate version over that." The cold was very clear. The city was very still below us. Her breath was making those small, visible clouds, and her composure was fully present and fully effortful, and she was doing both simultaneously, and the combination of them was the most honest thing I had ever seen from a human face. I said, "Ines." She said, "What?" I said, "Stop holding yourself so still." She blinked once. I said, "You have been holding yourself so still for so long. You can stop." Something in her face did a slow, visible thing, not collapsing. She was not the kind of person who collapsed. More like a structure releasing tension it had been carrying past the point of necessity. The composure remained, but the effort behind it quieted, and what was left was simpler and more real than anything I had seen from her before. I stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, close enough that the almost was very specific and very charged. I said, "I was in a gallery in October telling someone that the artist was making the viewer do half the work." She said, "Yes." I said, "You were there in September. Before that." She said, "Yes." I said, "I need you to understand that I am not here because Marco wasn't enough. I am here because you are specifically you, and I have been paying attention to specifically you for 8 months, and I know the difference." Her breath did the small, barely visible thing again. She said, "I know you do." I said, "Good." I closed the remaining distance. I touched her jaw first, just my hand against her jaw. Warm skin. The specific warmth of a person who had been standing in the December cold and was warm anyway. She went very still, not the forced stillness of composure, but the natural stillness of someone receiving something they have been waiting a long time to receive. Then I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was patient and specific, and it had the quality of something earned by everything that had come before it. 9 months of appropriate versions and catalog details and 20-second deliberations in hallways. Her hand came to the back of my coat and rested there, light and certain, not a claim, not a demand, just a hand saying, "I am here, I am staying, this is real." When we broke apart, the city was still doing its Saturday things below us, entirely indifferent, and the December cold was still sharp and useful, and she was looking at me with those gray eyes, finally not managing anything, just looking. She said, "September." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have found a way to say something earlier." I said, "Yes, you should have." She said, "I'm sorry it took this long." I said, "I know you are." I said, "I'm going to need you to be honest with me when the appropriate version is easier than the real one. That is a condition." She said, "Yes." I said, "And you are going to have to deal with your family." Her expression shifted slightly. Not with fear. Ines Varga was not a woman who was afraid of things, but with the particular weight of a person accounting for the cost of a decision they have already made. She said, "I know." I said, "Not today." She said, "No, not today." I looked at her, the December rooftop, the city, the specific quality of her face without the effort behind the composure. I said, "Today I just want to know what it looks like when you are not choosing the appropriate version." She said, "This." She gestured without irony at the rooftop, at us, at the whole improbable, specific situation. "This is what it looks like." I said, "I can work with this." She almost smiled, almost the millimeter, the corner of the mouth. And then she actually smiled, which was different and more, and I cataloged it the way I had cataloged everything else about her, with the understanding that this one went in a different file. We stayed on the rooftop for another 20 minutes, her hand at my arm, the city below us, neither of us pretending it was anything other than what it was. Then we went back down through the building she had designed and out into the December street, and she held the door, as she always held the door. She said, "I would like to take you to dinner. A real dinner, not coffee." I said, "Tonight, if you are free." She said, "Good." She took me to a restaurant in the neighborhood near the building, the kind of place that felt like it had been there long before the neighborhood had become the kind of neighborhood where places like that existed. We stayed for 3 hours. The conversation was continuous in the way of two people who have been managing their own separate stores of information about each other and are finally permitted to spend them freely. She told me about the building she had designed at 29 that had been demolished by the developer 2 years after completion. I told her about the account I had walked away from at 26 because the brief required me to obscure something true about the product. We talked about what it costs to choose the honest version when the appropriate version is available and structurally easier. Walking out, she took my hand on the pavement. Just took it. The way she had done everything since the rooftop, with the simple directness of someone who has stopped composing the appropriate version and is working directly with the real one. The complication came in December, which I had known it would come and had not known exactly how. It came in the form of Raphael. Raphael called me on a Wednesday evening, which was the first time he had ever called me, and I answered because Raphael was the warmest person in the Varga orbit, and his calling me directly was either a kind gesture or significant news. It was significant news. He said, "Adela knows about the coffee meetings." Marco told her. "She knows." I said, "Knows what, exactly?" He said, "That you and Ines have been meeting. She has put her own interpretation on what that means." A pause. "Tara, she has said some things to Ines. I wanted you to know before Ines called you, because I thought you should hear it from someone who is not in the middle of it." I said, "How bad?" He said, "Significant. She has told Ines that pursuing this is a betrayal of Marco. Those are approximately the words she used. A betrayal of Marco. Marco who had said I know, Mama without so much as a breath of hesitation. Marco who had managed his mother's opinion of me for 8 months with careful private agreement, while presenting a different version to my face. I said, "How is Ines?" A pause. He said, "She's Ines," which means she is not telling anyone how she is. But she called me afterward, and she was very quiet in the specific way that means it cost her something. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "She would have told you herself. I just wanted you to have a minute to prepare." I called Ines. She answered in one ring. She said, "Raphael called you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I was going to call you tonight." I said, "I know. What did she say?" A pause. Not the composing kind, the kind where she was deciding how much of the real version to give me. I said, "All of it, please." She said. She said that whatever I thought I was doing was a betrayal of the family, that I had always prioritized my own judgment over the family's well-being, that she used words I am not going to repeat because they are not accurate, and I did not dignify them with a response. I said, "Ines." She said, I did not tell her she was wrong. I told her that my choices were my own and that I was prepared to deal with the consequences of them and that she should not contact you. I said, "Did she accept that?" A pause. "My mother does not accept things. She files them." I said, "What do you need?" She said, "Nothing. I handled it." I said, "Ines?" She said, "What?" I said, "That is the appropriate version." A long silence. Then she said quieter, "I need to see you." I said, "Come over." She came. She arrived in the dark coat and the professional hair, and she was visibly not the version of herself she would have presented to anyone else, not falling apart, because she was constitutionally not a person who fell apart, but carrying something heavy in the specific way of people who have been carrying things alone for a long time and have finally permitted someone else to know the weight. I opened the door. She stood in the hallway of my apartment for a moment. She said, "My mother said that I have always been difficult, that I have always prioritized what I think over what the family needs, that this is the most selfish thing I have done. I said, "Come in." She came in. I made tea because the situation called for something practical and warm, and she sat at my kitchen table in the dark coat, and did not take the coat off for a while, which told me more than anything she had said on the phone. I set the tea in front of her and sat across from her, and said nothing because what she needed first was not a response. She looked at her hands, then at me. She said, "I have been the difficult one in my family since I was 12 years old. Difficult in the sense that I say what I think, and I do not manage my mother's feelings the way Marco does. I was never going to be the accommodating one. I understood that, and I accepted the cost of it a long time ago." I said, "And this?" She said, "This is the cost presenting itself in a form I had not fully accounted for." I said, "Are you going to pay it?" She looked at me. She said, "Yes." I said, "Good." She said, "I want you to understand that I am not asking you to carry any part of this. This is my family's difficulty, and I am not going to put it on you as a weight you are required to manage." I said, "I know you're not. But you are sitting in my kitchen in your coat at 8 in the evening because it cost you something and you needed somewhere to put it." She looked at me. She said, "Yes." I said, "That is not a problem. That is what I am here for." She was very still for a moment. Then she took the coat off, set it over the back of the chair, picked up the tea, and the specific quality of the stillness changed, became less effortful and more natural. The way things become when a person stops managing and simply is. We sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. We talked about her mother and what it had meant to be the eldest in a family that understood love as management, and what it had cost to be the one who refused to be managed. We talked about the specific difficulty of wanting things clearly, in full view of the people who would prefer you wanted less. At 10, she said she should go. At the door, she put the coat back on and stood in the hallway and looked at me. She said, "I am going to talk to Marco. He should hear what is true from me, rather than whatever version he has been constructing since he told our mother." I said, "What are you going to tell him?" She said, "The truth. That I care about you. That this is not a betrayal of him but a separate thing, and that if he is honest with himself he will know that what happened at that dinner was the end of his relationship with you, and not a thing I created." I said, "He is going to take that badly." She said, "Yes. He is also going to take it honestly, which is the version I am offering." I looked at her. In the apartment hallway light, she looked tired and real and exactly herself. Not the composed version, not the appropriate version, just Ines, who had sat in my kitchen in her coat and told me that her mother had called her selfish and had decided to pay the cost anyway. I stepped forward and kissed her once, brief, specific. Her hand found my arm and held for a moment. She said, "I'll call you." I said, "I know you will." She left. I stood in my hallway and thought about September and October and the 8 months of appropriate versions and what it meant that all of it had arrived here. In a kitchen at 10 in the evening, with the coat coming off. The conversation with Marco happened 2 days later. She told me afterward that it had gone the way she expected. Badly first, and then quietly. And then with the specific resignation of a man who has been forced to account for the honest version of something and has found it less comfortable than the one he had been telling himself. He did not call me. I had not expected him to. That chapter was finished. Adela did not call either. What she did, according to Raphael, was go very quiet for several weeks. Not accepting, not agreeing, just processing something that did not fit the version of the family she had been running for 20 years. Raphael told me this over coffee in January, the 3 of us at a table near the window of a place in the middle of the city that was neither her neighborhood nor mine. He looked at Ines and then at me with the easy, uncomplicated warmth that was his entire register. He said, "For what it's worth, I always thought you were the wrong fit for Marco, and I could never say so because he was my cousin and you were his girlfriend. I can say so now." Ines looked at him. He said, "I also thought from the very first family dinner that Ines was watching you with the attention she usually reserves for buildings she is trying to understand structurally. I did not say that either, for obvious reasons." I said, "How long ago was that dinner?" He said, "The first one you attended." I looked at Ines. She said, to Raphael, "You could have said something." He said, "I could have created significant family drama and lost the ability to be useful to both of you. I chose instead to be useful." He refilled his coffee. "I consider it one of my better calls." Ines said, "It was." The three of us sat in the January cafe and I thought about the Varga family and all its layers, the managing mother and the accommodating son and the difficult eldest and the warm cousin who had been watching everything from the outside and choosing, with great care, when to speak and when to wait. I said, "Raphael, thank you for calling me when Adela found out, for being the person you are in that family." He said, "Someone has to be." He smiled at Ines with the particular affection of a cousin who has known someone their whole life and watched them finally stop holding everything at the cost of appearing to have nothing. And it was never a hardship. January became February. Ines and I existed in the specific territory that new things exist in, careful and honest and occasionally difficult in the productive way of two people learning the full version of each other rather than the managed one. She was, it turned out, not cold. She had been described as cold by her brother and accepted as cold by her mother's acquaintances, and understood as cold by colleagues who did not know how to read economy as warmth. She was not cold. She was precise. She was the kind of person who put her full attention on the things that earned it and gave nothing to the things that did not. And if you had not earned it yet, you read the nothing as coldness because you were not yet inside the boundary where the full version lived. I was inside the boundary. It was warmer than I had expected and more demanding, because she expected the same quality of honesty from me that she practiced herself. It required me to be the version of myself that did not manage, the one that said what the thing cost, the one that asked for help before the cost became structural. I was still learning. She was patient with the learning in the specific way of people who have made the same mistakes themselves and know the shape of the correction required. In March, Adela called Ines. Ines told me about it the evening after, over dinner at the restaurant near the building she had designed, which had become something like our place by the accumulation of evenings there rather than by any deliberate designation. She said, "She asked me to come for Sunday dinner." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said yes, with conditions." I said, "What conditions?" She set her fork down. She looked at me in the candlelight with the gray eyes that I had been cataloging for 6 months, and which now had the quality of something I recognized like my own handwriting. She said, "That you would come with me, not as a concession or an accommodation, as the person I am bringing because you are the person I want at the table." I looked at her. She said she needed time to think about that. I said, "How much time?" She said, "She has 2 weeks. And then I go without the condition if she does not agree, and she either accepts that or she does not. And either way, I have been clear about what I am choosing." I said, "Your mother is not going to make this easy." She said, "My mother has not made anything easy since 2019. I have adapted." She looked at me with the direct, level gaze that was her equivalent of a declaration. "I am not telling you this to be reassured. I am telling you because you asked me to be honest when the honest version is harder than the appropriate one, and this is me being honest." I looked at her across the March candlelight and thought about September. About 8 months of the appropriate version chosen every day, at significant personal cost, for reasons that were ethical rather than cowardly, and which had still cost both of us something real. I said, "Thank you for choosing the honest version, every time it was available to choose." She said, "Not every time. I should have said something in September." I said, "You said something in March." She said, "March of the following year." I said, "I know. And here we are." She held my gaze. The corner of her mouth moved. The millimeter, the barely, the specific inventory item I had been cataloging since October, and which I now recognized as the version of joy that Ines Varga permitted herself in public. Small, real, entirely present. She said, "Here we are." Adela accepted the condition in 11 days, which was 3 days before the deadline. Raphael told me separately that she had argued with Ines twice in between and lost both arguments, which he described as a historic occurrence. The Sunday dinner was in April. Ines picked me up. She was in the dark charcoal blazer that I had come to understand was her equivalent of armor for situations that required both professionalism and presence, and her hair was up, and she looked at me when I opened my apartment door with the complete, cataloging attention and the something underneath it that was no longer being managed and had not been for several months. She said, "Ready?" I said, "Are you?" She said, "I have been ready since September. I simply required time to be honest about it." She held out her hand. I took it. We went downstairs together and into the April evening. The drive to Adela's house was 20 minutes. She said, "She is going to be difficult tonight. She is going to direct it at me, not at you, because she has been trained to be gracious in her own house, and she will not be ungracious to a guest in front of witnesses." I said, "You are not worried." She said, "I did not say that. I said I was ready. Those are different things." The house was as I remembered it, large and old and maintained with the careful intention of someone who understood that the condition of a house is a form of communication. April had done something to the garden that winter had not. There were flowers coming up along the path, tulips and something lower and purple. Raphael opened the door before we knocked. He greeted us with the warm, uncomplicated handshake from me and the shoulder touch for Ines and the face of a man who had decided he was going to be very good at dinner this evening. He said quietly to both of us, "She has made the thing with the pastry, the one she only makes when she is trying." Ines said, "I know the pastry." Raphael said, "It means she is trying." Ines said, "I know what it means." She squeezed my hand once, brief, before we went in. Adela was in the dining room. She was in a cream blouse and her composed graciousness, and she looked at me when we entered with the expression of a woman recalibrating, not warmly, not coldly, with the specific attention of someone who has made a decision and is accounting for what that decision means in practice. She said, "Tara." I said, "Mrs. Varga, thank you for having me." She said, "Of course." She looked at Ines. Something passed between them. The complex, layered communication of a mother and a difficult daughter who have been having the same argument in different forms for 20 years and have recently arrived, not at resolution, but at something more honest. Dinner was not easy. It was not hostile. It existed in the careful, slightly effortful space of people who are choosing to attempt something rather than simply performing it, which is a harder and more real kind of effort. Adela asked me about my work, the real version of the question, not the assessing version from 8 months ago. I answered honestly. She listened. She asked a follow-up that showed she had heard the first answer. It was work, and it was real. And by the end of the evening, it was the beginning of something that was not friendship but was honest, which I decided was the better foundation anyway. Raphael told 2 stories that made the table laugh. Constanza was there and asked me about my apartment. Marco was not at the dinner, which Raphael had either arranged or simply noted, and his absence was acknowledged by no one and felt by everyone and processed by each person at the table, according to their own specific accounting. Ines sat beside me. She was composed in the professional way, and present in the other way, and when, once, under the table, her hand found mine briefly, I held it for 3 seconds before she withdrew it. 3 seconds was enough. It said, "I am here. This is real. Neither of us is pretending." Walking to the car afterward, Adela stopped us at the door. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in the tone of a woman who has decided on a version of something and is delivering it with full intention, "You are welcome in this house." I said, "Thank you." She said nothing else. She went back inside. The door closed. Ines and I stood on the path in the April evening with the tulips on either side and the city beyond the garden wall and the specific quality of an evening that has cost something and delivered something real in return. She said, "That is not an apology." I said, "I know." She said, "It is, for my mother, approximately equivalent." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me. In the April evening light, with the composure fully present and the thing underneath it fully present alongside it, both at once, no longer competing, no longer requiring one to hide the other, she looked like the version of herself that had always been there under the management, complete, real, done choosing the appropriate version. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The version of what I wanted to say, in the hallway, the one that took 20 seconds. I said, "You have said it, on a rooftop in December." She said, "Not all of it." I looked at her. She said, "The part I did not say is that I have been in love with you since the funding reception in September. Not interested in you, not drawn to you, in love with you. In the specific, inconvenient, structurally significant way that requires you to account for everything sitting on top of it before you can move it. I have been accounting for everything sitting on top of it for 7 months, and I am done accounting and I am ready to say it plainly." The April evening was very still around us. I said, 7 months. She said, September. I said, "I have been paying attention to you since October, which is 1 month less, and I need you to know that I am not behind you on this. I have simply been arriving at it from a different direction." She said, "I know." I said, "Good." I kissed her on the path beside Adela's tulips with the April evening light on both of us and her mother's front door 20 feet behind us, and the city beyond the garden wall entirely indifferent to the specific, structurally significant thing happening on the path. Her hand settled at my waist and stayed there. Not a claim, not a performance, just a hand saying, "I am not going anywhere. This is where I choose to be." When we broke apart, she looked at me with the gray eyes and the full presence composure and the September in them, and I thought, this is what it looks like when a woman who has been choosing the appropriate version for too long finally chooses the real one. "It looks like this. It looks exactly like this." She said, "The pastry was good." I said, "It was." She said, "It means she is going to try." I said, "I know." She said, "It will not be fast." I said, "I know that too." She said, "But it will be honest." Which is the version I intend to hold to, regardless of what it costs. I looked at her. The woman who had sat in a dining room and said, "Then she's my mistake now," without flinching. The woman who had spent 7 months choosing the appropriate version at significant personal cost and had finally, on a cold November pavement, put it down. The woman who had taken me to a rooftop in December and told me the honest version and kissed me with the patience of something earned rather than something taken. I said, I know. I believe you. She said, good. We walked to the car. She held the door, as she always held the door, and I got in. And she came around to the other side and sat beside me in the April dark, and we drove out of Adela's neighborhood and into the city, and neither of us said anything for a while, and the silence was not the appropriate kind. It was the kind of silence that is simply two people being present together without the weight of everything they are managing. I reached across and put my hand on hers on the gear shift. She turned her hand over and held it. 1 sugar, no milk, remembered from a single conversation. A seat to my left in a dining room. 20 seconds in a hallway. 9 months of accounting for the cost. The city moved around us in the April dark. Somewhere ahead there was a restaurant we liked, and a building she had designed, and a rooftop that was technically not open to the public, and a Sunday dinner that had been difficult and real, and had arrived at the beginning of something honest. I thought, this is what the version that is actually true looks like when you finally stop choosing the appropriate one instead. I thought, it looks very much like this. She squeezed my hand once. I squeezed back. The city went on. We went with it.